Well, it's all come to this. The final episode of Murder Drones is here. Arguably the most important episode in the entire series, as it's this episode that will leave the biggest lasting impression of Murder Drones as a show and heavily influence its legacy. And it's due to that fact that my expectations have been raised because of how much importance is riding on this finale, and given that my standards are already high for this series because of how high quality the content this show has delivered in the past, you best believe that despite the title, disappointed isn't even where to begin when describing how much I hate this episode. I'm going to go over a summary of the events that happen in the finale, so if you want to get right to the review, skip to the time displayed on screen. The finale begins with Copper 9 blowing up, launching the teacher in his classroom into space. We then cut to Uzi, who is also in space, witnessing Copper 9 having a massive hole blown into it by Sin. While in space, Nori reunites with Uzi, explaining that in order to defeat Sin, she's going to have to destroy her core. After this, Uzi gets hit by the ship Jay had in the last episode, and is pulled inside by N. Their reunion is cut short as a giant tendril from the core of Copper 9, being controlled by Sin, rips their ship in half, causing them to plummet from space down towards the surface of Copper 9. As they fall, Uzi asks N if they are dating, and N says yes, and they hug each other as they fall. Meanwhile, on a piece of Copper 9 floating through space, Jay is about to kill Thad, Lizzie, and Khan, but is interrupted when V, riding on one of the Sentinels, attacks her for working with Sin. Jay tells V that although she was tricked by Sin, it's still better on the winning team, and offers to have V help her in Sin, which ends with V rejecting her offer and attacking her. As they fight, N and Uzi fall past them and try to destroy Sin's tendrils by throwing a black hole into the planet's core, but it's caught by Sin, and she begins to attack them. In the attack, N is badly injured, but Uzi is able to drag him into a nearby building as they hide from Sin. Sin searches through the building and tries to take control of Uzi while N is having a panic attack, but fails once Uzi grabs N's hand to calm him down and keep control of her mind. V then crashes into the building after getting hit with a missile from Jay, and calls out for N, apologizing for lying to him and that she was trying to keep them safe. Uzi thinks it's a trap and holds N back, but Sin creates a hologram of N in an effort to lure V. N then yells out to V to tell her it's a trap, and he immediately has his core ripped out by Sin. Sin tells V that she had one job, that if she killed all the Solver hosts, she would leave N and V alone, but failed to do so, and is now going to suffer the consequences. V and Uzi escape outside as Sin pursues them, and stands in a doorway as she's about to eat N's core, but her arm holding the core is cut off as Khan remotely shuts the door on her. N's core scrambles back to his body, and Uzi, N, and V have a giant battle against Sin and Jay. Sin tries to control Uzi again, but fails as Uzi now has complete control of her mind, and as Nori's Night Core plays, the battle begins. The battle is hard fought, with Jay being the weakest link, and is knocked down a hole, and V and N get knocked away, leaving just Sin and Uzi. Sin tries to go for a final strike by teleporting behind Uzi to rip out her core, but Uzi predicts her teleport and rips out Sin's core instead. Uzi then uses a black hole to shoot a hole through the other side of the planet, so sunlight can shine through, destroying Sin's core. But just like Eldritch J's core back in episode 2, it instead turns into a black hole and begins to float towards Sin's body to revive her. Having no choice, Uzi swallows the black hole, which nearly kills her, but she survives, now having a mix of purple and yellow LEDs. At first, V is wary, thinking she's being controlled by Sin, but it's still Uzi, and the trio celebrates. The show cuts back to the teacher's classroom as Uzi retells the story, and everyone half cheers with N and V now integrated into the worker drone's colony, and Khan now being reunited with Nori. The credits roll showing the characters' lives afterward, with N and Uzi being a happy couple, Lizzie and V being best friends, a funeral for Doll, and Jay now working on repairing the spaceship that she destroyed in episode 7. The series ends with Uzi looking into her locker mirror and flashing like she's one of the Absolute Solver's holograms, as her tail, which is now controlled by the Absolute Solver, tells her that she would look nice with a bow. This is a newsy episode first and foremost, as most of the supporting cast get very few standout moments, with the exception being V. V in this episode does exactly what you would expect of her, which is to be aggressive and feud with Uzi, and while V's feud with Uzi in this episode especially develops their relationship as they finally silently confirm to be friends with each other, V's standout moment is when she apologizes to N. Ever since episode 1, V has treated N badly, belittling him, abusing him, ignoring him. She has done everything in her power to make him dislike her, and in absolute end it's finally revealed why. She was deliberately trying to distance N from the truth that it's Sin that has been giving her and Jay orders to hunt down any worker drones with the Absolute Solver, and in return Sin won't kill them. She never lost her memory, she never hated N, she has always cared for him since the manor, and throughout the entire series, she has been trying her best to hold up her deal with Sin for their protection, and that is a lot easier if N doesn't interfere. This was the greatest reveal in this episode and completed her arc in a believable and intelligent way that recontextualizes all of her actions throughout the series. This reveal was so good, in fact, that I dare say that V, who I have considered throughout the entire series to feel like an incomplete and poorly written character, to possibly be one of the best written characters in the entire show now. I just wish that we had a one-on-one conversation between her and N for this reveal, as it could have been a much more impactful realization moment for N and the audience to piece together what this means and how V's actions make so much more sense in hindsight with this information. Of course, even though this reveal was so good, I can't deny that her survival of the events of Dead End wasn't that surprising and made episode 6 a worse episode retroactively. V was also in desperate need of a scene explaining how she survived and tamed a sentinel, as that is never questioned by anyone, even though it really should have been, as everyone just kind of accepting it without question comes off as unbelievable and lazy writing. Also, am I the only one who was annoyed that despite V's sacrifice and her return, N didn't interact with her at all until their final scenes in the classroom? You think N would at least try to hug V or ask her how she's alive, given that he is shown to be so upset after her death and mass destruction, but no. Instead, her death isn't questioned by anyone and the episode moves right along like nothing ever happened. Still, the faults with V's survival are completely forgivable, as having her character redeemed in this episode was well worth the cost of the questionable writing and the detriment of Dead End's quality as an episode. Unfortunately, as far as side characters go, V is the exception and the rest of them are mishandled or borderline useless. Lizzie has always been a comedic relief character, and the two standout scenes she gets in this episode, where there is a running gag of V's sentinel trying to kill her, serve the purpose of being comedic well, as they are amusing, but beyond that, Lizzie doesn't do anything else in this episode, and her overall purpose in the show is to become V's best friend so that it doesn't seem like Uzi stole N away from V, leaving her all alone, which isn't actually a bad purpose for Lizzie. She's a supporting character for V, and she did that throughout the series well. As for Thad, however, I don't know why this character was brought back in episode 7. He quite literally does nothing, and doesn't have a single meaningful interaction. I think it's implied that he might have become N's best friend, but that theory is purely based on how Thad treated N in episode 2, and how he's sitting next to N at the end of the episode. Yeah, this show would have been much better off if he had just been one of Uzi's victims in episode 4. Khan is in a similar situation, where he also doesn't really do much besides inconvenience Sin at one point, but other than that, Khan doesn't matter and doesn't even have a real bonding moment with Uzi or Nori, so even if his arc of being a better dad and being proud of Uzi is completed in this episode, it feels like an afterthought and is never recognized by anyone within the actual show, making his arc feel anticlimactic and pointless. Nori was barely in the episode, and although her reunion with Uzi was enjoyable while it lasted, it was cut far too short, and Nori desperately needed more worthwhile interactions with Uzi, and especially Khan, to justify her existence in this show. The only other real scene we get with Nori after her conversation with Uzi is her very brief reunion with Khan, which should have been an important and heartfelt moment that gave each character closure, but it was turned into a joke. Yeah, all that build-up throughout the series with Uzi trying to find her mom barely had any payoff, and this character should have been written out of the story completely. We never even learn which disassembly drone killed her, despite there being a hint in episode 7 that it was N, and yet it's never brought up again. This character was an absolute waste of time. The teacher also made a return and was as great comedic relief as ever, and the way he acted was very relatable to how I felt after watching the episode. And lastly, of the side characters, we have Jay. I have so much to say about Jay. To begin with, what was the point of her character? I'm genuinely asking. What did she contribute to this story after she was brought back in episode 3? She doesn't deliver any exposition on backstory, she doesn't serve the narrative or plot in any way, and throughout the entirety of this episode, she is more of a nuisance than a real threat. We do get the smallest exploration of her character when she mentions she was tricked by Sin, but this character didn't need a one-off line to explain how she reacted to Sin being the one that tricked her. She needed an entire scene. We know for a fact that Jay cared for Tessa, it is implied in episode 5, but Tessa being dead isn't even acknowledged by Jay. Why give this character depth of having another character to care for if it never has any consequences or is even acknowledged throughout the show. Jay's knowledge of her being tricked by Sin doesn't matter because it doesn't change any facet of her character. She never mourns Tessa, she never second guesses Sin, she never shows any sign of regret after this single line. It blatantly doesn't matter or change anything about Jay, instead of faking out the viewer into thinking she's a deeper character with potential for having a tragic and interesting arc, when in reality, she doesn't. And you know what makes Jay's involvement somehow worse than it already is in the episode? It's that absolute end made Jay a worse character. Jay openly admits that the reason she's been working with Sin is for the sake of being on the winning side. This means that despite Jay seemingly being loyal and caring for Tessa, which again is the only development she has gotten throughout the entire show, is effectively retconned by the fact that Jay cares more about her own survival rather than to avenge Tessa. This isn't character development. This is character regression. This is character assassination. Jay is an overall less interesting and worse written character because of this episode. So, keeping that all in mind, I have one last question about Jay. Why didn't she die? There was absolutely no reason for Jay not to die in this episode, which would have at least given this character a conclusion, but she doesn't, which makes no sense as she doesn't appear again in the episode anyway, outside of her being in the background of a credits scene. I love Jay more than anyone, but this might be the worst possible fate for her character, as she doesn't get a resolution, a conclusion of a character arc, or anything. She's just stuck in a disappointing limbo of being an afterthought who served no purpose to the story and wasn't even important enough to get a death scene. As for the main trio of this episode, let's start with Sin. Sin was the best character in episode 7, and she is the best character in episode 8, and overall is one of the best characters in the show. She's as intimidating as she is funny, her dialogue and facial expressions are some of the best in the series, she created some wonderfully intense and disturbing moments, she got plenty of screen time and stole every scene she was in, she's just an incredible character. I am left feeling a little dissatisfied though, as even though Sin is a great character, she's pretty shallow. If the best villains are known for their motives and relationships with the main character, Sin doesn't even scratch the surface for being a well-written villain. There were hints back in the beginning of episode 5 and briefly in the pilot that the Absolute Solver and Sin are separate entities, which would entail that at some point we would get to see a distinction between the two, but like so many other plot threads throughout this series, this aspect of her character is seemingly dropped as nothing comes of it, and it's never mentioned after episode 5, which was really disappointing and a painfully missed opportunity to develop Sin and the Absolute Solver more. Then there's the Absolute Solver's motives, which are seemingly non-existent as it's the force of nature trope that seemingly does what it does for no reason other than it can, which isn't an antagonist trope I dislike, but makes it hard to say that the Absolute Solver is interesting or complex. Next up is N, who is N. Outside of his romance with Uzi, the only moment of any value that happens to him is him getting a panic attack, which just made me roll my eyes as the panic attacks in animation meme is proven true yet again, and in typical tropish manner, he stabilizes because Uzi holds his hand, which once again makes the only thing that happened to him in this episode that isn't Uzi related end up becoming Uzi related. I suppose there is a moment where he yells out to V so she doesn't fall into Sin's trap, which wasn't related to Uzi, but the longer you think about this moment, the dumber it becomes. As far as N knows, V should be dead. There is no reason for him to believe that she's still alive after the last time he saw her, and in episode 7 he knows that Sin can imitate her voice. So in this scene, where N knows Sin is trying to find him and he hears V's voice, any intelligent character would know that it's a trap, and wouldn't fall for it, but he yells out anyway, and it's because of pure dumb luck and lazy writing that in this instance his instincts of it actually being V were correct. So if you want to use this scene as a highlight of N doing something that isn't based around Uzi, by all means go ahead, but this scene only highlights the impulsiveness and idiocy of N's character. But besides Uzi and V, there are some other minor arcs of his that come full circle, like him learning how to draw, which I enjoyed because it actually added an interest to his character that doesn't revolve around the purple emo drone, and there's also him being a pilot like he was established to be in episode 2, that although was a nice callback, just ended up highlighting how rushed this episode is, and how the consequences of episode 7 are treated like a joke. Wouldn't it have been great to see N have to process thinking that Uzi is dead and see how he acts when he doesn't have her around to tell him what to do? Finally giving him at least some scenes where he's acting based off his own autonomy and not trying to be Uzi's guardian angel. I think that would have been great to see, but instead, somehow off screen, he knows that Uzi has been transported into space after falling down a pit that leads to the center of a planet, goes back up to the surface, takes the time to draw a fun letter to Jay, which just implies how unserious he was when he was separated from Uzi, and then flies into space even though it's implied in episode 2 that he's a bad pilot, and then finds her without there being any implications that he was seriously worried about her, which just cheapened their reunion. Finally, we have Uzi, who really taps into her gremlin, purposefully cringe personality in this episode, which I can't blame you if you find her annoying, or like she's trying too hard, but there were so many other things about this episode that were bothering me that Uzi's dialogue being questionable is pretty low on the list of things about this episode that I found lackluster or upsetting. Otherwise, her confession scene with N was heartfelt, and all the accompanying Newsy scenes felt like they weren't distracting, and more of just subtle additions that were well-integrated treats for Newsy fans to enjoy. And as I mentioned earlier with V, Uzi finally shows that she cares for V, which concluded their rivalry in a satisfying way. Other than that, the only real notable thing about Uzi is that she merges with Sin, which made me feel absolutely nothing, and she nearly dies at the end of the episode, which made me feel even less, because of how many fake-out deaths there are in this series. At this point, I was just wanting Uzi to die so the characters actually sacrifice something along their journey, but of course she survives, further cementing the fact that there are next to no consequences for anything that happens in this series. I think it's fairly obvious to everyone how the characters in this episode were handled. All N and Uzi really get is romance, V gets one of the most glossed over returns in the entire series, along with an amazing closure to a series-long arc that is immediately brushed over by the show. Sin is a really cool character and a less than mediocre antagonist, and all the side characters would have served the series better if they had died for emotional effect, or just written out of the series entirely. Now, despite how divisive this episode is, there is one thing we can all agree on. The fight scenes in Absolute End are phenomenal, and some of the best fight scenes I have seen in recent media in general. The J and V fight was the weaker fight of the two, but even then their fight was still great, and it was nice to see V and J interact with each other for the first time in the series. It's a shame that what V and J had to say to each other served very little importance to the narrative and characters themselves, but excusing the impressively amateurish feat of letting some of the most obvious opportunities to make this episode and characters better slip through the writer's fingers, the fight choreography is still good. But what people really love about this episode, and is one of the most impressive accomplishments Absolute End was able to deliver, was the final fight against Sin. I don't have the adjectives in my vocabulary to describe how good this fight scene is. It's one of the best moments in the show, one of the best fight scenes I have ever seen in animation outside of anime, and is the example to point to for the advantages of animating a show in 3D instead of 2D. The directing, the choreography, the lighting, it's a visual masterpiece. But it's not perfect. If you're going to have a 3 versus 2 fight scene, it is crucial that every character in the fight gets at least one moment to impress the viewer, so no character feels wasted. And this is not the case in this fight. There is one character in this matchup who literally does nothing. And who else could it be other than Jay? Because of course it is. Throughout the entirety of this fight, she dodges a shot by Uzi's railgun, gets the railgun thrown at her, gets decapitated, gets the only attempt she made at attacking in the whole fight blocked by V, and then gets knocked out of the fight and is never seen again or mentioned until the credits. If you remove Jay from this fight, nothing would be different, and that's terrible character utilization. I also am not extraordinarily impressed by how Uzi defeats Sin. I think that Uzi predicting Sin's teleport so that she teleports right into Uzi's hand, letting her grab her core, was really cool. But then Uzi blasts a hole through the planet to burn the core, which only made me question why she never attempted that during the fight, and I think I would have preferred if the sun would have played a larger element in Sin's defeat. I think it would have been really cool if throughout the fight Uzi blasted holes through Copper 9 to create light rays in order to limit Sin's movement, which would have accentuated a more strategic approach in the final battle that is equally clever and creative, which are two elements that makes me hold fight scenes in a significantly higher regard. That isn't to say this fight was in no way tactical though, as Sin pretending to be N to catch Uzi off guard was a great callback to episode 2, and the strategy of psychological manipulation is always an element that I enjoy in fight scenes. I also can't say I wasn't disappointed by the music choice, which isn't to say that the direction to use Nightcore for the final battle was bad. In fact, it thematically is very appropriate for a character like Uzi, so I think it's fairly well thought out. But as a Liam fan, the one thing I wanted more than Jay to get a meaningful character arc is for Liam to compose a new track for this show. In case you don't know, Liam is an expert song composer, and some of his best songs are those that would fit perfectly in a battle just like this one. So yeah, I was disappointed by the lack of a new song by Liam, as it would have added that much more of a personal touch to this battle by the show's creator, and would have made me reminisce about how far Liam has come as a creator. So overall, the fight scenes really are that good, and even though I'm the only person who noticed some missed opportunities and problems with them, I still hold them in very high regard and are good enough to justify watching this episode just for them. Because believe me, there isn't much else worth watching this episode for. Sure, the references in this episode are nice, as they are callbacks to previous episodes, such as the Absolute Solver's holograms, N's drawing skills, Khan's remote to the doors, the key bug, the final frame of the show is a callback to the teaser trailer, the railgun that didn't actually do anything, every character who's died in the series getting a brief reference, and for those classic Liam fans out there, we even get some art that is very reminiscent of his SSTWL era. But although all of this is nice fan service, none of it really matters. What does matter is if Absolute End is a good finale to the series. And let's face it, it's not. The actual ending of everyone but Doll and Tessa getting a happy ending wasn't bad, but it was way too safe for a series that is known for its unpredictability. How is it that throughout this entire show, the only two characters of any importance that died were Doll and Tessa? I'm not asking for N or Uzi to die, but Thad, Lizzie, Khan, Jay, and V? None of these characters dying just cheapens the emotional impact this show could have left. And like I said a long time ago, this series needed more serious and emotional moments, and any of these characters' deaths could have provided that. So I'm not going to say I hated the ending, but it wasn't impressive, daring, experimental, or innovative in any way, which are all the traits that I fell in love with this series for. Another important aspect of a final episode is how well it ties up loose ends and character arcs, and this finale did a terrible job. Why were the spires built? How did V survive? Is Sin a separate entity from the Absolute Solver? And if so, what happened to her? How did Uzi end up in space? How did N know Uzi is in space? Who killed Nori? How did V get into the bunker to kill Doll's parents? What were in the other drop pods from the end of the pilot? Where did the drop pods launch from? If humanity is truly dead, are effective drones actually cloned more? Where is Jay trying to go after she repairs her ship? What was the deal with the Absolute Solver and the mirrors? Are the worker drones now all just collectively fine with the murder drones living amongst them? Are there more disassembly drones out there? Or did they all die to the Sentinels? What was going on with all the satanic drawings all over Tessa's bedroom? How did V know Jay was working with Sin? Why did Jay make that concerned face in Dead End? Why does the Absolute Solver make meat out of inorganic material? If Uzi transferred the Absolute Solver into herself, shouldn't Sin be set free? And why did the Absolute Solver want all the Solver hosts killed? I didn't expect an answer to all these questions, but the fact of the matter is that so much throughout the series is left unexplained that the series feels incomplete, which is the last thing a finale should make the audience feel. Therefore, purely as a finale, Absolute End failed to live up to its very purpose. And it all can be tracked down to one reason. Every issue I have had about this episode is all because of a reason that once was leaked, everyone knew would be a problem. The runtime, and as a result, the atrocious pacing. 20 minutes is a joke. This episode needed 40 minutes at least to give justice to the series, and you can tell within the first 5 minutes as all the setup from episode 7, with Jay facing off against Thad, Lizzie, and Khan, and N, who everyone expected to be devastated after Uzi's fake-out death, are both thrown out the window as we get a time jump at the beginning of the episode just like in episode 4. Sure, this saved some runtime, but it was at the cost of episode 7's quality, as Jay's face-off and Uzi's death are all rendered meaningless. And that's only the beginning of the problems this episode inherited from having such a short runtime. Absolute End was so rushed that to make this episode feel like it was worth the wait, It opted for pretty visuals and fight choreography to impress the audience instead of delivering a satisfyingly complete Murder Drone story, because of how much there is for this series to wrap up in 20 minutes isn't close to enough time for this series to conclude everything in a satisfying way. If we had at least 10 minutes more of characters talking to each other about everything that's happened instead of trying to shove monologues into the middle of fight scenes, maybe the viewer would actually have some time to process the implications of what was just said. But before they can, the show is already moving onto a new action sequence, destroying any chance for the viewer to feel, think, or process anything. If this episode tried to spend time telling an actual story, or tie everything in this series together in a meaningful way instead of pure action, maybe this episode wouldn't have been delayed. Maybe this show could have at least tried to attend to the #1 complaint about this series, that is, it's too fast-paced, instead of leaning into that criticism more to the point where it feels like it's purposefully trying to not give you an opportunity to think so that you don't notice the shortcomings of this episode. Maybe instead of prioritizing style and visuals over storytelling, there could have been some emotional and intellectual value to the episode. Maybe some of Murder Drone's biggest stumbles as a show along the way could have been redeemed. Maybe some unanswered questions could have been answered. Maybe some of the side characters could have had a purpose. Maybe this episode could have been meaningful, but it's not. I have a hard time believing that Liam would be satisfied with delivering such a shallow finale to his first ever show when he has proven in his past works that he is good at playing with the viewer's emotions and can tell nuanced explorations of how characters feel, how the events they are going through affect them mentally, and not being afraid to kill off characters in a way that changes the circumstances of the story like he did with Tessa. Liam quite literally built his career and reputation around these aspects of his storytelling, and if there was ever a point in Murder Drones where he had to show the best his writing skills have to offer, it would have been in Absolute End, and yet none of those writing strengths of his can be found in this episode, leaving us with a visually impressive yet mind-bogglingly vapid display of storytelling that is unenjoyable to anyone who wanted to be mentally or emotionally stimulated, beyond seeing the Newsy ship come to complete fruition. The only understandable reason this episode had such a criminally short runtime that destroyed this episode's potential is that all of the budget went into the animation quality, which left not enough funds to animate this episode to be longer than 20 minutes. This is the rational explanation for why we were given such a rushed and superficial final episode to the series, because any competent writer, which I know Liam can be, wouldn't create a series finale like this. Absolute End is a tragedy to Murder Drone's legacy. It's pure style over substance. If you are a fan who thinks that newsy, references, and some well-animated fight scenes are enough to qualify Absolute End for being a good finale to the entire series, you probably will like this episode. But if you're a fan who cares about pacing, substance, character arcs, character development, character utilization, emotional value, intellectual value, narrative conclusions, narrative consistency, or just decent writing, Absolute End is a complete and unrewarding letdown that failed in every area that could have been meaningful or nuanced, alongside having such a severe drop in writing quality that this single episode heavily damaged the median quality of the entire Murder Drone series and has forever tarnished my opinion of the show.